here's one of the big questions, because you have a number of former Soviet nations that are members of NATO, right? Latvia, Poland, you got a number of these. And they border with Russia. So why isn't Ukraine? That's been a big question. So let's dive into that a little bit, because I think it's important for you to know, especially as all this discussion has been underway. So really, like I said, this conflict it's been going on for quite some time. And Russia's had troops in the Donbas region for, over 8 years now. Now, when Biden was inaugurated in 2020, Zelensky, when he was asked about this by, I think it was Ukrainian press, they said, well, what would your first question to the new U.S. leader be? And Zelensky's answer was, Mr. President, why are we not in NATO yet? Now, there's been a lot of cooperation between Ukraine and NATO. There's a lot of things that the organization, which I'm kind of wondering about the effectiveness of it at this point, what they've been doing, and what NATO does, and in cooperation with Ukraine. I mean, it's pretty much, it's all but a formality. So Ukraine, going back to like 2008, and even before then, there was a lot of stuff, with the poisoning of different leaders, et cetera, in 2004. But going back to 2008, rather, Ukraine and Georgia, they began that formal process to join NATO. It's called a Membership Action Plan. But then after the 2010 election, everything was stopped. And that is when you had Viktor Yanukovych, he was the one who was elected leader of Ukraine. And Yanukovych was pro-Putin, pro-Kremlin. He was very much against Ukraine joining any kind of European alliance, any sort of European alliance, right? You have the Eurasian Economic Union with Russia, and that is what Yanukovych wanted to join, as opposed to the European Union. And then Euromaidan began, all the protests, right, in 2014, and he fled. He fled the country. And all the protests and all of that stuff, you remember seeing all of that on the news. That was in Kiev. And citizens were infuriated because they wanted more independence from Moscow, not more dependence on Moscow. And so as a result of that and some of the conflict with Russia, that membership action plan to join NATO was not continued. And there was a lot of concern that there would be like a Russian retaliation or whatever over it. So all of that was stopped. It was all paused. The interim government came to power. And then in 2014, later on, that's when Russia first invaded Ukraine and they annexed Crimea. And so after that membership action plan has been a major priority for Ukraine, and they've been pushing it. And there's been a lot of support. A lot of the support, especially after the annexation of Crimea, has increased to join NATO and to be more aligned with EU as opposed to the Eurasian Economic Union, which is, again, where Russia is. And so this was summer of last year. That's when NATO was assuring Ukraine that you'll eventually become, through this, membership action plan, you'll eventually become a member of NATO, and Russia's not going to have any influence on this process or our consideration of this alliance. And so that is why Ukraine is not a member of NATO right now. So you have some of the backstory on that. So there's a lot there. And remember, in the end, and I think before Zelensky, and this was after Yanukovych, you had Poroshenko, who was still friendly with Kremlin, not as much of a kind of a puppet as Yanukovych was, but a lot friendlier towards Kremlin and Moscow. And Biden, really, because remember, Biden and Poroshenko were the ones that had that close relationship, while Hunter Biden was on the Burisma board. Zelensky, not so much. And so that's where we are. That's why they aren't officially a part of NATO.